This is a population density map of the United States, showing where most Americans currently live today. And if you pay attention to the southeastern corner of the country, an interesting pattern appears that's unlike anywhere else in the country. Here, across the states of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, the coastal areas are very sparsely populated to the point of almost appearing empty. Instead, most of the major populated urban areas in these states are located hundreds of kilometers away from the coast, deep within their interiors, across cities like Atlanta, Augusta, Columbia, Greenville, Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, and Durham. By contrast, the only large settlements located on the coast of these states are Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. And yet, Charleston doesn't even crack past a metro population of 900,000, while Wilmington and Savannah both have fewer than 500,000 people. Despite their seemingly strategic locations on the coasts, none of these coastal urban areas are the largest in their respective states. Savannah is only the third largest metro in Georgia, behind the interior cities of Atlanta and Augusta. Charleston is the second largest metro in South Carolina, behind the interior city of Columbia, while Wilmington is only the sixth largest metro in North Carolina, behind the interior cities of Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Durham. This population pattern is unusual, especially when you look further in either direction to the north or the south of these states where the pattern is completely reversed. From Virginia all the way up through Maine, the most major population centers all hug nearby to the coastline, including the Northeast Corridor running between Washington, D.C. and Boston, the most densely populated part of the whole country with more than 50 million people. And almost immediately south of Georgia start the major coastal population centers of Florida, running from Jacksonville to Miami on the east coast to Tampa and St. Petersburg on the Gulf Coast, all of which have significantly more people than any of the coastal cities in Georgia or the Carolinas do. So this then begs the question, why is there a void in population density along the east coast of the United States across the Carolinas and Georgia in between the super-dense coastal areas in the Northeast and Florida? And why do all three of these southeastern states' biggest clusters of people avoid the coast and keep hundreds of kilometers away from it deep within their interiors? The answers, I found out, are very interesting and probably a lot more complicated than you might have thought at first. The North American continent, like every other one of Earth's continents, can be divided up into different physiographic provinces, which are areas with specific geology, soils, and morphology that are distinct in their own way. So, if you're distinct enough to separate them from neighboring areas, in the eastern United States, the most dominant geographic feature that can be found are the Appalachian Mountains, which stretch across the interior of the eastern seaboard from central Alabama through northern Georgia, the Tennessee-North Carolina border, the Virginia-West Virginia border, then up through western Maryland, central Pennsylvania, and northwestern New Jersey, and then further up through New York and across into western Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, up into Canada. One of the most ancient cities in the world, the Appalachians were once, around 300 million years ago, probably about the same height as the towering Himalayas are today. But hundreds of millions of years of erosion and tectonic forces have dramatically diminished their size down to their current smaller form, a process that also led to the creation of two present-day physiographic provinces between them and the ocean. The Piedmont region, which are basically the foothills of the Appalachians, where the landscape is largely made up of gentle but easy-to-traverse rolling hills, atop of hard bedrock, and the Atlantic coastal plain, a largely flat, sandy, and often swampy landscape that has been slowly built up over the eons by the vast amounts of sediment deposited from the rivers flowing down from the eroded Appalachians. When you look carefully at the map of these regions, you should notice that the Atlantic coastal plain is very wide in the south through the states of Georgia and the Carolinas, separating the higher Piedmont and Appalachian regions from the coast by hundreds of kilometers. But then, beginning in Virginia, the further north you travel, the more the plain starts to dramatically narrow all the way up to modern-day New York City and Long Island, where it effectively ceases to exist. In New York City, the coastal plain is so narrow that the foothills of the Catskill Mountain Range penetrate into the city itself in the Bronx. While way further south in Georgia, the coastal plain is hundreds of kilometers wide. You can notice this geographic divergence in New York City almost immediately when you travel either north or south. To the north of the city, beginning immediately in Connecticut and extending all the way up through Maine with the exception of some of southern Massachusetts, the bedrock extends directly to the coastline itself, so it's rocky, hilly, jagged, and absent of sandy barrier islands. While to the south of New York City, including Long Island, all the way down to Florida along the whole Atlantic coastal plain. The coastlines are smooth, sandy, often covered by marshes and swamps, and are protected by long, thin barrier islands. Meaning that building coastal cities is easier from New York City to the north than it is to the south. Now, across almost the entire eastern seaboard from New York City south through Alabama, a line divides the lower elevated Atlantic coastal plain in the east from the higher elevated Piedmont region in the west. Across this line, the landscape, and more importantly the elevation, changes gradually rather than suddenly. But as the rivers flowing down to the Atlantic coast from the Appalachian Mountains cross over this line, they cross over, from the highly elevated hard rock of the Piedmont, and relatively speaking, they plunge in elevation, forming rapids and waterfalls in the process before entering into the lower, flatter, and sandy sediments of the coastal plain, where they progress more easily the rest of the way out to the sea. The many rapids and waterfalls found across this diverging geographic boundary is what gave this line its pretty straightforward name, the Fall Line. Arguably the most important geographic feature to know about in the entire United States, that few people outside of this region have ever heard about. When European settlers and colonists began coming to North America in large numbers during the 17th century, the continent's rivers were the primary means available to them to travel from the ocean into the interior. And all across the eastern seaboard from New York City south to Georgia, the rapids and waterfalls marked by the Fall Line marked the furthest into the interior that their ships were physically capable of reaching. Once they hit the Fall Line coming from the ocean, they'd have to unload their ships and relocate all of their cargo and people onto smaller ships or wagons to access any deeper into the interior. While smaller ships carrying goods from any deeper in the interior downstream couldn't pass through the falls or rapids on their way out to the ocean either. And so they'd have to stop, unload, and transfer all of their goods coming in this direction as well. All of this meant that setting up settlements along the Fall Line to take advantage of warehousing and storage needs, banking, and trade made perfect economic sense. Settlements established at the points of rapids and falls along the Fall Line were destined to become major inland trading hubs because they were the most capable of processing and facilitating trade between the mineral and agricultural riches of the Piedmont region and the maritime ports established further downstream at harbors on the coastline. Even further, the inland cities on the Fall Line were also able to exploit and harness all of the energy that the rivers generated by thundering down through the falls and rapids, which enabled them to become early manufacturing centers with mills, easy access to the raw materials of the Piedmont further upstream, and easy access to the harbors further downstream for their finished goods to be exported out to global markets. The Savannah River was naturally navigable for about 320 kilometers into the interior before it hit the Fall Line, which is precisely where the city of Augusta was founded. The Congaree River was naturally navigable for about 170 kilometers deep into the interior before it hit the Fall Line, which is where the city of Columbia was founded. The Potomac River was naturally navigable for about 195 kilometers inland from the Chesapeake until it hit the Fall Line. Before it did is where Washington, D.C. was founded. For these reasons, between central Alabama and New York City all along the Fall Line today, you will find the modern cities of Montgomery, Alabama, Columbus, Macon, and Augusta in Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, Fayetteville, Raleigh, and Durham in North Carolina, Richmond and Fredericksburg in Virginia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, New Brunswick and Trenton in New Jersey, and of course, New York City at the tail end of it. The presence of the Fall Line and its effect on human geography in the Fall Line has been a key factor in the development of the Fall Line. The Fall Line in the United States is so profound that it can even be viewed from space like in this image. Note how the farms located to the west of the line in the Piedmont region are significantly greener than the farms located to the east of the line on the Atlantic coastal plain. This is because many millions of years ago, before the Appalachians dramatically eroded away, the Fall Line basically marked the extent of the ancient coastline. And what is now the Atlantic coastal plain were mostly stretches of low coastal waters that had been slowly filled in with deposited sand. The Fall Line was a great example of this. The Fall Line was a great example of sediment and sandy soils. As a result, the soils found across the Atlantic coastal plain are often sandy, acidic, low in nutrients, and while still useful, they're generally not as fertile or useful as the soils found further up in the Piedmont region are. The Atlantic coastal plain is also dotted with the highest concentration of swamps and wetlands that can be found anywhere in the North American continent, which not only results in poor drainage for agriculture compared to the Piedmont region further upstream, but it also makes developing settlements and infrastructure significantly more challenging than in the Piedmont region as well. And as you can see from this map, the extent of swamps and wetland-type environments stretch significantly further inland in Georgia and the Carolinas than they do further north, beginning in Virginia, lining up almost exactly with the width of the Atlantic coastal plain and the extent of the fall line. In effect, this meant that founding cities on or near the coast was much easier and made much more sense the further north you went from Virginia, as the difficult to build in swamps and wetlands decreased in width, and as the fall line approached the coast in New York City. But the Northeast and even further south in Florida also just have much better natural harbors to work with than the coastal areas of the Carolinas and Georgia do. The jagged and rocky coastlines of New England beyond the end of the fall line produced excellent natural harbors in Portland, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, and the Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. While further south, geography blessed the East Coast with one of the greatest natural harbors anywhere on the planet, at the mouth of the Hudson and East Rivers in New York Harbor. Directly connecting deep into the interior through the Hudson River that was historically navigable all the way up to Albany, and since the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825, all the way into the Great Lakes in the Midwest. Further south, Delaware Bay and the Delaware River offer another fantastic harbor that was largely exploited by Philadelphia. And then even further south is the massive Chesapeake, one of the largest protected bodies of water that can be found anywhere on the planet, that is also home to the Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach Harbor on its southern end, which, like New York, is also one of the greatest natural harbors that can be found anywhere in the world. It is the deepest natural harbor that can be found all along the whole East Coast, and its strategic location roughly in the dead center of the East Coast, and at the entrance to the Chesapeake meant that it always had enormous potential for naval power projection. And it's why it ultimately became the largest base for the U.S. Navy worldwide, and the largest shipbuilding and repair industrial base in the world as well, where all of America's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers are currently constructed at. But the Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach Harbor is also strategically well located because the coasts of the Carolinas and Georgia further to the south of it are much, much less suitable to building a giant port at. Beginning almost immediately to the south of Hampton Roads are the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a long string of shifting sandy barrier islands that create what is arguably the most dangerous coastline for ships on the planet. Since record-keeping began here, the Hampton Roads are one of the most dangerous coastlines in the world, and they are the most dangerous coastlines in the world. More than 500 years ago, back in 1526, more than 5,000 ships have sunk in these treacherous waters around the Outer Banks. A number so large that it's earned the region an infamous nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. At the location of Cape Hatteras in the Outer Banks, the coastline of the east takes a sudden and sharp turn north, breaking the generally northeastern direction that the coast previously takes all the way from Georgia. Just off of the coast of Cape Hatteras, where this geographic turn happens to be the most dangerous coastline in the world, is where the warm waters from the Gulf Stream flowing up from Florida collide with the cold waters from the Labrador Current coming down from Canada, which generates high levels of turbulence that kick up a lot of sediment. Meanwhile, the continental shelf of the Outer Banks is sloped very gently, which causes sand from the deep waters to become almost constantly pushed up onto the shallower shelf, and for sand from the shallower shelf to become almost constantly pulled back into the deep waters, creating an unpredictable and dangerous environment of almost constantly shifting sandbars and shoals to make navigation through here an extreme challenge. Even in modern times, ships still sink all the time out here, like a 100-foot commercial fishing trawler that sank in 2024 while attempting to pass through the Oregon Inlet. Itself a narrow passage that was violently torn through the barrier island here during a powerful hurricane in 1846. Whole brand new islands can appear out of nowhere in the Outer Banks and then be destroyed just as quickly as they came, like Shelley Island recently was in 2017, when it appeared in April near Cape Hatteras and reached around 1 mile long and 500 feet wide before collapsing back beneath the waves again less than a year later by early 2018. These conditions require ports to conduct almost constant dredging operations just to maintain stability, and have plagued the coast of North Carolina for centuries now, while they also prevent deep water inlets in North Carolina from forming naturally, which is why all throughout the Outer Banks there have never been any significant ports established and no significantly sized coastal cities ever settled. Pretty much the only decent natural harbor on the whole North Carolina coast beyond the treacherous Outer Banks is at Wilmington in the far south of the state, along the mouth of the Cape Fear River, which is of course why Wilmington is the first major coastal settlement going any further south from Virginia, but even the inland in Wilmington isn't particularly deep, while the Cape Fear River itself is shallow and also doesn't really go anywhere. Even today, after modern locks and dams, the Cape Fear River is only navigable up to Fayetteville, and mostly just by small motorboats and canoes rather than cargo-laden ocean-worthy vessels, which is why Wilmington never really became a huge coastal city on the same kind of scale of the Northeast. Beyond Wilmington, there are two other useful natural harbors along this whole coast of North Carolina, and one of them is the Cape Fear River. Both of which are actually world-class natural harbors that are vastly superior to Wilmington. Both are very highly sheltered and have very deep waters that have made them extremely important and valuable trading ports for centuries now. Even today, Savannah is the second busiest container port on the whole East Coast behind only New York, while Charleston is the fourth busiest behind just Virginia. And Charleston is also the second deepest harbor on the East Coast behind Virginia Beach as well. For most of their early histories, Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington actually were the biggest cities in each of their respective states, because of their relative advantages of being strategically useful ports at the mouths of rivers that extended up to the fall line deeper within the interior. Farmers, miners, and manufacturers could send their goods from the Piedmont to the cities along the fall line, and then safely down the rivers the rest of the way to these ports for export to the global market. But despite them being good natural harbors and busy ports, none of them were really ideal locations for huge cities like on the coast in the Northeast and Florida. There are a lot of reasons why. First of all, hurricanes. This is a map of hurricane risk exposure across the continental United States, and as you can see, the Gulf Coast and southern coast across Georgia and the Carolinas are very highly at risk for getting hit by them. But interestingly, right at about where Virginia begins, the risk of hurricane strikes begins growing lower all the way up through the rest of the Northeast up to Maine. The waters further up the East Coast are cooler and deprive hurricanes of their primary fuel source, while prevailing currents and winds tend to guide hurricanes up here northeastward deeper into the Atlantic, away from the coast. Moreover, the way that the coastline bends at Cape Hatteras and the Outer Banks of North Carolina also means that hurricanes moving parallel to the coastline from the south will begin moving away from the land rather than towards it once they've passed through this area. Throughout records going all the way back to 1851, the Carolinas lumped together have been impacted by 90 hurricanes that made landfall in Georgia by 22. While just a little further north, Virginia has only been impacted by 13 of them and New York by just 15. Virginia has never once been impacted by a major Category 3 to 5 hurricane since record keeping. While North Carolina has been hit by 7 of them, South Carolina by 5, and Georgia by 3. The Carolinas and Georgia are not quite as exposed to dangerous hurricanes as Florida is further south, but they're also a lot more exposed to them than the rest of the East Coast is from Virginia further north, which further hinders their ability to develop their coastal areas. Even more problematic for these states' coastal development prospects are all of the marshes and swamps that surround their coastlines and that surround their harbors. While Savannah is a major hurricane, Georgia is a major hurricane, and Georgia is a major hurricane. While Savannah, Charleston, and even Wilmington are all valuable natural harbors, they're also all surrounded by wetlands and swamps that make sprawly urban-style development around them very challenging and restrict their abilities to grow. They're also just about the most perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes that you could possibly imagine. And this also highly influenced why the coasts here remain fairly unpopulated compared to their interiors. Malaria, the deadliest disease that humanity has ever known, was not originally indigenous to the Americas. It first arrived alongside European settlers and enslaved Africans during the 1600s and rapidly proliferated among the local mosquito species found in the southeast coastal plain, where the environment was a close match to where it came from in tropical Africa, with hot, humid summers, abundant rainfall, and almost limitless tidal marshes. By the early 1700s, the rice and indigo plantations that were established across the coastal plain in the Carolinas and Georgia required vast irrigation systems that were built through the tidal marshes in the area, which were a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes and the malaria that they carried. While the labor system that exploited huge numbers of enslaved Africans ensured almost constant human-mosquito contact that enabled malaria transmissions to be sustained season after season. By the 1700s, malaria had become so deeply ingrained across the Atlantic coastal plain through Georgia, the Carolinas, and parts of the Pacific Ocean that it was hard to imagine that there would ever be an end to it. It was only in the late 1800s and early 1900s that the state of Virginia that it eventually simply became known as the malaria zone, with extremely high mortality rates during the summers when malaria infections peaked. Because the higher elevated Piedmont region in these states didn't have the same swamps, marshes, and stagnant water issues that led to the rampant mosquitoes and malaria infections in the coastal plain, the wealthy and white elites of these states throughout the 18th and 19th centuries often fled inland to the Piedmont region during the summers to escape from the peak malaria situation. They left their enslaved laborers behind to continue working on in the brutal conditions out in the fields. This led to an ingrained demographic shift in these southeastern states where major coastal ports like Charleston and Savannah would become depopulated during the summers while the towns in the Piedmont would experience seasonal summertime surges in population. And it's also why all three of these states eventually established their capital cities far away from the coasts deep within their interiors of the Piedmont, so that they'd have more stable, year-round populations. Atlanta for Georgia, Columbia for South Carolina, and Raleigh for North Carolina. A fact that solidified the political importance of the interior of these states in further boosting their populations relative to the coasts, in addition to all of the previous fall line advantages and being further away from the destructive effects of hurricanes that batter the coasts. The northeast coast just didn't have any of these same kinds of problems. Their coastlines were located right by the fall line. Reducing the advantages of building further into their interiors. Their coasts weren't impacted by hurricanes as frequently, and they also weren't surrounded by malaria-infested swamps and wetlands that made building cities and sustaining large populations around them difficult. Instead, in the northeast, the climate worsened as you traveled deeper into the colder interior. While in the southeast, it was the exact opposite, where the climate actually improved as you left the coasts and traveled deeper into the interior. But a really weird part of this whole story is how malaria-infested swamps and wetlands never actually affected Florida as badly as it did coastal Georgia and the Carolinas, which isn't really what you'd probably expect at first. Most of that has to do with the fact that up until the mid to late 19th century, Florida was always very sparsely populated by Europeans, and so there wasn't as much of an opportunity for malaria to become ingrained and sustained through constant human interaction the way that it was through slavery in Georgia and the Carolinas. Florida is also an infamously swampy place. Most of its coastal marshes are saltwater marshes, which is less ideal for the specific species of mosquito that most often carries malaria, who prefers fresh or slightly brackish standing water instead. That's a lot more common in Georgia and the Carolinas. The mosquito species found in South Florida were less efficient vectors for malaria than the species that were found in the Carolinas and Georgia. Most of the major early coastal towns that were settled in Florida, like St. Augustine and Key West and later Miami. Florida is also an infamously swampy place that was often carried by aliens or other located on barrier islands or exposed coasts with heavy sea breezes, which are less mosquito-friendly environments than stagnant tidal inlets. In contrast, Charleston and Savannah were both founded directly among tidal estuaries and rice fields, which meant that the cities themselves sat directly in the middle of mosquito and malaria country. Thus, malaria never ingrained itself to become as much of a menace in Florida the same way that it did in coastal Georgia and the Carolinas, and so it had less influence on the demographic population pattern in Florida than it did in Georgia and the Carolinas as well. Malaria continued being a major menace in these parts of the Atlantic coastal plain throughout the Southeast for generations. The collapse of the plantation economy based on slavery ended after the Civil War in 1865, which led to the abandonment of rice fields and began reducing the mosquitoes' breeding areas. In the late 19th century, quinine became more available that offered treatment for malaria, though not outright prevention, while further urbanization in the southeast continued reducing the mosquitoes' habitat. As late as the 1930s, though, malaria was still endemic throughout rural coastal Georgia and the Carolinas, and it was still such a problem that the predecessor to the modern Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, was founded in nearby Atlanta in 1946, with the initial explicitly stated objective of finally annihilating malaria from the southeast coast for good. Through a combination of widespread DDT spraying, habitat modification, and window screening initiatives throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, malaria was finally largely eliminated from the southeast for the first time in centuries since the 1600s, which basically means that only about since the early 1950s has malaria not been a constant and pervasive fear throughout this region that had long hindered settlement and development beforehand. Another major reason for the huge population centers in the interiors of the South China Sea was the spread of malaria. Malaria was a major reason for the spread of malaria in the early 1930s and early 1950s. The most common cause of malaria is the spread of malaria in the southern part of the South China Sea. The majority of these three states has to do with the advent of railroads as well, especially in the case of Atlanta. Up until the 1830s, nothing existed where Atlanta does today at all. At the time, the major settlements were Savannah, and the cities founded along the fall line across the state like Augusta. But at the time, Georgia wanted to rely less on the seasonal nature of its port in Savannah for trade, and so they wanted a railroad that would connect Savannah to Chattanooga, and thus to the Tennessee River and the greater Mississippi River system that would open up the state of Georgia to direct trade with the whole of the Midwest. In order to do that, though, they needed to build a railroad around the Appalachian Mountains that stretched just to the east of Chattanooga and down into far northern Georgia. So in 1837, the initial route they selected for this railroad ran southward from Chattanooga to a terminus in northern Georgia, just south of the Appalachian foothills in a relatively level area that they decided would be connected directly to Savannah next. And that terminus just happened to be the one that was connected to the state of Georgia. The terminus just happened to be the site of modern-day Atlanta, making Atlanta quite possibly one of the first major cities in human history to have ever been developed in a completely arbitrary location rather than by its specific geographic features. By 1838, a small settlement had arisen around the site that was first known as Terminus, and it adopted its current name of Atlanta a decade later in 1847, supposedly as a feminine version of the word Atlantic. Named after the Western and Atlantic Railroad that went through the town, Atlanta never became a major town until after the end of the Civil War when it rapidly industrialized and urbanized, and especially after Georgia's capital was relocated to Atlanta in 1868. By 1880, Atlanta grew to finally surpass Savannah as Georgia's largest city, and it's held that title in the state ever since. Similar stories happened in the Carolinas as well. Charleston was South Carolina's largest city for most of the state's history, until it was eventually overtaken by the interior city and capital of Columbia that's located directly along the fall line sometime in the 1940s. And Columbia's metropolitan area is still larger than Charleston's is to this day. Similarly, in North Carolina, Wilmington on the coast was the state's largest city until sometime before the 1910 census, which was the first one that showed Charlotte surpassing it to become the state's new largest city that had several of the same advantages as Atlanta had going for it. Atlanta became the meeting point for multiple railroads, connecting it to Savannah and the southeast coast, to Montgomery and the Gulf Coast, and to Chattanooga and the Mississippi River system in the Midwest. It evolved into the primary railroad junction for the entire southeast region and basically became the Chicago for the southeast in the process, which cemented Atlanta's early importance as a major logistics center for the whole southeast region. During the 1950s and 60s when the interstate highway system was built out, Atlanta once again became a major highway junction on top of its pre-existing status as a major railway junction, with I-20, I-75, and I-85 all crossing through the city. And building on top of both of those, Atlanta was also destined to become a major air travel hub during the 20th century as well. Atlanta is geographically well positioned from an air travel perspective at about the center of the southeastern United States. Within only around an easy 2-hour flight from Atlanta, you can travel as far as Miami to the south, to New York City or Chicago to the west. And you can travel as far as Miami to the south, to New York City or Chicago to the west. And you can travel as far as Miami to the south, to New York City or Chicago to the north, to Kansas City or Dallas to the west, and everything else in between. Putting almost the whole country east of the Mississippi within just a 2-hour flight of the city. That fact made Atlanta a perfect connecting point for flights traveling between Florida, the Gulf Coast, the Midwest, and the Northeast. While for long-haul east-west flights, Atlanta was close enough to every other city in the east to be a logical stopover point without forcing any exceptionally long detours. And the weather in Atlanta is also one of the most important factors that make Atlanta a great destination to travel to. Atlanta is also ideal for conducting year-round major air operations in too. There's basically a nice, narrow band of areas stretching across the interior of the eastern U.S. from central Texas through Arkansas, Tennessee, northern Mississippi, Alabama and Georgia, and western North Carolina. That's sort of a Goldilocks zone that's too far away from the coastline to be severely affected by hurricanes, but not too far north to experience high snowfall winters either. Two events that can both severely disrupt airport operations. Atlanta, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Charlotte International airports are all located within this zone and are all among the top 10 busiest airports in the whole country. It was for these reasons, on top of Atlanta's previous status as the Southeast primary rail logistics hub, why Delta Air Lines selected Atlanta to become their headquarters early on in 1941, and why they steadily turned Atlanta into their global hub of operations. By 1957, Atlanta had already become the biggest airport in the United States. Atlanta had already become the biggest airport in America by terms of passenger traffic, a status that it has continually held to this day, and going even further beyond that, Atlanta has also managed to become the busiest airport in the entire world too. And from there, with Atlanta's position as an inland logistics superhub secured, came many, many more businesses and jobs that have made it into a corporate powerhouse today. Today, it features the headquarters of many well-known companies like Delta, UPS, Home Depot, and Coca-Cola. The government's continued use of Atlanta as the headquarters for the CDC, maintaining the city's gravitational pull for jobs and people. So across all three of these southeastern states, the reasons for why so few people live on the coast and why most people live deep within the interiors is a lasting legacy of ancient geology, geography, history, and circumstance. The nature of the fall line and the more mild climate of the Piedmont region encouraged early settlement to move further inland. The swampy marshes and wetlands, which were once the most important part of the Piedmont region, that became malaria hotspots for centuries, heavily discouraged large settlements and development across the southeastern portion of the Atlantic coastal plain up until the mid-20th century and only further encouraged settlement further inland. And led to Georgia and the Carolinas all relocating their political capitals away from their big coastal port cities further inland early on in their histories. The frequency of hurricanes that batter the coasts here and the unprecedented dangers of the Outer Banks in North Carolina to navigation and coastal development only further solidified this overall trend. And then the advent of railroads and later air travel and highways only further increased the inland trade potential of the cities within the interior, giving them easy connections to markets without having to rely so much on their ports like Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. And that, all in a nutshell, is why there is not one single metropolitan area of more than 1 million people on the whole southeast coast today between Virginia Beach and Jacksonville. Why this void of population density continues to exist in this part of the East Coast between the highly populated coasts in the Northeast and Florida on either side of it. Something else you